Refugee by Gratz. Mahmud, Izmir, Turkey, 2015. 11 days from home. God help us. That is what we're to ride in, Mahmud's father said. The boat wasn't a boat. It was a raft. A black inflatable rubber dinghy with an outboard motor on the back. It looked like there was room for 12 people in it. 30 refugees waited to get on board. They all looked as tired as Mahmud felt and wore different colored life jackets. They were mostly young men, but there were families too. Women with and without hijabs. Other children, some who looked to be about Mahmud's age. One boy in Barcelona soccer jersey didn't have a life jacket but clung instead to a blown-up rubber inner tube. A few of the other refugees had backpacks and plastic bags full of clothes, but most of them, like Mahmud's family, carried whatever they owned in their pockets. Let's go, one of the smugglers said. 250,000 Syrian pounds or 1,000 euros per person. Children pay full price, including babies, he told Mahmud's father. There were 2 more Turks in the tracksuit, like the ones who had turned them away from the mall, and they stood apart, staring at the refugees like they were something disgusting that they had just washed up on the beach. Their scowls made Mahmud want to disappear again. Dad handed out their life jackets, and they put them on. Mom stared out at the black dingy bobbing in the gray-black Mediterranean sweater. She grabbed her husband's arm. What are you doing, Yusuf? Is this the right decision? We have to get to Europe, he said. What choice do we have? God will guide us. Mahmud watched as his father pushed the cash they'd saved into the hands of one of the smugglers. Then Mahmud and his family followed his dad to the dinghy, and they climbed on board. Walid and his mother sat down in the bottom of the dinghy, his mother holding Hannah tight in her arms. Mahmud and his father sat on one of the inflated rubber edges, their backs to the sea. Mahmud was already cold, and the wind off the waves made him shiver. A big bearded man wearing a plaid shirt and a bulky blue life jacket sat down right next to Mahmud, almost squeezing Mahmud right off the edge. Mahmud slid a little closer to his father, but the big man next to him just settled into extra space. How long will we be on board? Mahmud asked his dad. Just a few hours, I think. It was hard to tell on the phone. Mahmud nodded. The phones and chargers were safely sealed away in plastic bags in his parents' pockets, just in case they got wet. Mahmud knew because he'd been on one who dug through the trash for the resealable zipper bags. We don't have to get all the way to Greek mainland, Dad said. Just the Greek island of Lesbos, about 100 kilometers away. Then we're officially in Europe, and we can take a ferry from there to Athens. When the smugglers had packed the dinghy full of refugees, they pushed it into sea. None of the smugglers came with them. If the refugee were going to get to Lesbos, they were going to have to do it themselves. Does anyone know if dinner is served on this cruise? Mahmoud's father asked, and there was a few nervous laughs. The outboard motor roared to life, and the refugees cheered and cried. Dad hugged Mahmoud, then reached down to hug Mom, Waleed and Hannah. They were finally doing it. They were finally leaving Turkey for Europe. Mahmoud looked around in wonder. None of this seemed real. He had begun to feel like they were never going to leave. Mahmoud had been so tired he could barely keep his eyes open before, but now the drum of the motor and the chop of the boat as it hit wave after wave flooded him with adrenaline, and he couldn't have slept if he'd wanted to. The lights of Izmir dwindled to glittering dots behind them, and soon they were out in the dark, rough waters of Mediterranean. Phone screens glowed in the darkness, passengers checking to see if they could tell where they were. The roar of the engine and the whip-blinding sea spray made it impossible to have any kind of conversation, so Mahmoud looked around at the other passengers instead. Most of them kept their heads down and eyes closed, either muttering prayers or trying not to get sick, or both. The dinghy began to toss, not just front to back, but side to side, in a sort of rolling motion, and Mahmoud felt the bile rise in the back of his throat. On the other side of the dinghy, a man shifted quickly to vomit over the side. "Watch out for the Coast Guard," the man next to Mahmoud shouted over the noise. "Turks will take us back to Turkey, but Greeks will take us to Lesbos." Mahmoud didn't know how anybody could see anything in the dark, cloud-covering night, but it helped his seasickness to look outside instead of inside the boat. It didn't help his growing sense of panic though. He couldn't see land anymore, just stormy gray waves that were getting taller and narrower, like they were driving a boat through a spiky tent tops at the Kilis refugee camp. More people leaned over the side to throw up, and Mahmoud felt his stomach churn. And then the rain began. It was a hard, cold rain that plastered Mahmoud's hair to his head and soaked him down to his socks. The rain began to collect in the bottom of the dinghy, and soon Mahmoud's mother and the others were sitting in centimeters of shifting water. Mahmoud's muscles began to ache from shivering and holding the same tight position for long, and he wanted nothing more than to get off this boat. "We should turn back," someone yelled. "No, we can't go back. We can't afford to try again," Mahmoud's father yelled, and a chorus of voices agreed with him. They pushed on through driving rain and rolling seas for what felt like an eternity. It might have been 10 hours or 10 minutes, Mahmoud didn't know. All he knew was that he wanted it to end, and end now. This was worse than Aleppo, worse than bombs falling and soldiers shooting and drones buzzing overhead. In Aleppo, at least he could run, hide. Here, he was at the mercy of nature, an invisible brown speck in an invisible black rubber dinghy in the middle of the Black Sea. If it wanted to, the ocean could open its mouth. And swallow him, and no one in the whole wide world would ever know he was gone. And then that's exactly what it did. "I see rocks," someone at the front of the dinghy yelled. And there was a loud boom, like a bomb exploding, and Mahmoud went tumbling into the sea. just outside Havana Harbor, 1939, 17 days from home. A strong hand grabbed Joseph by the arm and swung him around. It was a sailor, one of the ship's firemen, and Joseph knew right away he was in trouble. The firemen were big, churlish brutes who were supposed to be on board to put out fires. But lately they'd been walking the decks, harassing the Jewish passengers. They'd been making troubles ever since the Cubans had told them they could leave the ship. For 3 days, the St. Louis had sat an anchor kilometers from shore. For 3 days, while port officials came and went, the Cuban police who guarded the ladder of the ship told the passengers they couldn't leave today. Manana, they said. Manana. Tomorrow. 2 days ago, the SS Orduna, a smaller English passenger liner, had arrived and anchored nearby. Joseph guessed it was one of the other 2 ships they'd been racing to Cuba. He and the other passengers had watched as launches went to and from the ship as the yellow quarantine flag went up and down, and then the Orduna had lifted anchor and cruised into dock at the pier and let off passengers. Why had they been allowed to dock and not the St. Louis? The St. Louis had gotten there first. Captain Schroeder wasn't around to ask, and the officers and stewards had no answers for the passengers. And then today, the same thing happened with the French ship SS Flandre. It arrived anchored nearby, passed quarantine, docked at the Havana pier, and let off its passengers. Now it was sailing back to the sea. The passengers on the St. Louis had grown more and more restless, concerning sailors on deck and berating their stewards at dinner. Joseph had felt the tension mounting all over the ship, the pandemonium threatening to boil over every time the crew dealt with the passengers. It was as suffocating and oppressive as the 100 degrees heat. Apparently, Chandrick Dick and his Nazi friends had felt the tension too, because that's when the firemen patrols had begun. It was nothing official, Joseph was sure, because the captain hadn't made an announcement. It was just certain members of the crew who had taken it upon themselves to police the ship like they were back in Germany for the safety of the Jewish, Chandrick told them. The same way the Gestapo took Jewish into protective custody. Another fireman stood beside the one who held Joseph's arm, blocking out the sun, and between them was Otto Schindrick himself. Just the boy who we were looking for, Schindrick said. You are to come with us? What? Why? Joseph asked, looking up at the 2 big men around him. Joseph felt guilty, and he was immediately mad to himself for it. Why should he be guilty? He hadn't done anything wrong. But he remembered feeling this way back home too. Whenever he passed a Nazi on the street, and in Germany, being Jewish was a crime. And here too, apparently. Your parents' cabin must be searched, Schindrick said. You have a key? Joseph nodded. Even though he thought he didn't want to. These men were adults, and they were Nazis. One he'd been taught to respect, and other he'd learned to fear. The big fireman still had Joseph's arm, and he pulled him toward the elevator. Joseph couldn't believe he'd let himself be caught. He had warned his little sister, Rufy, to avoid the firemen who loved to intimidate the children on board, and she'd managed to stay out of their way. But he'd lost himself watching the flounder sail out of Havana Harbor. His back turned to the promenade, and that's when they caught him. Shindrick and his fireman hustled Joseph down the stairs, and Joseph's stomach sank when they ordered him to the open door in his cabin. Joseph's hand shook as they put the key in the lock. He wished there was some way he could get out of this, some way he could keep these men away from his mother and father. Otto Shindrick reached down and turned the handle for him, throwing the door open. Papa lay on his bed in his underclothes, trying to stay cool in the stifling heat. Mama sat in a chair nearby reading a book. Rufy, Joseph, he was glad to see, was still up at the pool. When she saw the men, Rachel Landau stood. On the bed, Joseph's father propped himself up, a look of panic on his face. "What's going on here?" Mama asked. "Joseph, they made me bring them here," Joseph said, his eyes wide, trying to warn her of the danger. "Yes," Shindrick said, spotting Joseph's father. "There he is." Shindrick and the two firemen stepped inside. Shindrick closed the door and locked it behind them. "For your safety, this cabin must be searched," Shindrick said. "On whose authority?" Mama asked. "Does the captain know about this?" "On my authority," Shindrick told her. "The captain has other things to worry about." Shindrick nodded, and the two firemen ransacked the room. They swept Mama's makeup and perfume off the vanity and smashed the mirror. They knocked the lamps off the bedside tables and cracked the wash basin. They opened up the family suitcases, which were carefully packed and ready to go to Cuba, and threw their clothes all over the cabin. They tore the head of off Rufy's stuffed bunny. They snatched the book from Mama's hand and ripped out the pages, tossing them in the air like ashes from a bonfire. Joseph's mother cried out, but not so loudly that anyone else could hear. Papa wrapped himself in a ball and threw his hands over his head, whimpering. Joseph huddled against the door, angry at his helplessness, but scared that if he fought back, he'd only be punished more. When there were nothing left to smash or scatter, the fireman stood behind Shindrick at the door. Shindrick spat on the floor. "That's what I think of you and your race," he said, and suddenly Joseph understood this was a payback for his father's words to Shindrick at the funeral. Shindrick snorted dismissively at the cowering man on the bed. "It's time you had your head shaved again," he told Joseph's father. Otto Shindrick let himself and the two firemen out, leaving the door wide open. Joseph's mother slid to the floor crying, and Papa blubbered on the bed. Joseph shook, and he buried his face in his hands, trying to hide his own tears. He wanted nothing more than to run to his mother's arms, but she felt a million miles away from him. So did his father. They were 3 lonely islands, separated by an ocean of misery. Of all the things Shindrick and his firemen had broken, the Landau family was the one thing Joseph wasn't sure they were put back together. "You said if I was quiet, if I stood very still, they wouldn't come for me," Papa said. It took Joseph a moment to realize his father was talking to him. Joseph's breath caught. His father was talking about the medical inspection, when Joseph had scared his father to get him to straighten out. Papa looked up at him, his eyes red from crying. "You said they wouldn't come for me. You said they wouldn't send me back. You promised, and they came for me anyway." Joseph felt like his father has slapped him even though Papa hadn't touched him. Joseph reeled. He backed into his mother's little makeup table, and one of the bottles changing hadn't smashed, rolled off the shattered on the floor beside him. Joseph didn't even jump, but he had lied to his father, betrayed him, made him think he was back at the awful place, terrified him all over again. But that wasn't the worst thing he had done. Joseph had made his father a promise he couldn't keep.